All right, welcome back. We're still having conversations around the issue of the Africa Climate Summit that is currently going on at the KICC. Now, one of the things that we will be looking forward is the Nairobi Declaration. What are some of the decisions that are going to be made to enhance efforts to mitigate against climate change? Now, earlier on, I mentioned about the figures that are currently estimated at the total cost, including mitigation, that is between 2010 and 2099, which is estimated at around 46 trillion to about 230 trillion dollars. Now, we just want to go through some of the areas that we really feel should be considered. Again, one of the effects of climate change is the issue of increased health risk. We've seen a lot of this coming up over years. Again, the issue of our food and water insecurity, particularly within the continent of Africa. And when you look at Kenya, to bring it back home, we've seen a drought that has been touted to be the worst in about 40 years. And of course, we're also talking about economic consequences, where we have seen a lot of food insecurity, a lot of economic activities diminishing. We're looking about different industries from agriculture, fisheries, and as well as tourism, when some of this wildlife cannot survive the drought that has been there. We're also talking about security and conflict because of the limited resources that are available. And to help me with this conversation, we just want to understand how do we plug in the private sector to be able to invest and put money towards this mitigation. And I'm joined this afternoon by Sarah Mecca, who's the Director for Africa at the One Campaign. Sarah, welcome to KTN.
Thank you.
All right, so first things first, we know there's a huge gap in terms of climate financing. And of course, the question that then comes to mind is, what are some of the financial barriers blocking climate change effect mitigations, and why aren't we seeing a lot of African countries, African companies investing in this? Why isn't it a priority?
Thank you for that question. So I think we should establish that there are lots of African companies that are actually doing something in mitigation, whether it's the clean cooking or it's the innovations of carbon capture. We're seeing some action, but you are right, there is such a big gap. There's a big flagship report called the Songwe and Stern report that identified that low and middle income countries will need $2.4 trillion every year from now to 2025. That is a lot of resources. And so where are those resources going to come from? Some will have to come from private sector, some will have to come from countries themselves, but some will have to come from multilateral development banks. And this Africa Climate Summit, lots of conversations are being talked about capital, the cost of it, the quantity of it. So I think one of the significant hindrances to the private sector companies innovating around mitigation is really cost of capital and availability of capital. And that's why we're really excited about understanding that there's a challenge, but there's also a way to resolve the challenge. So what we've seen on the financing landscape is that African countries get 5 times higher interest rates when they borrow in the capital market. And that's significant. Over a life of a bond of 15 or 20 years, we're seeing that African countries are paying $56 billion more to borrow in the capital markets because they're getting rates like 7% interest rate, 5% interest rates. Now, there's a body called multilateral development banks with the World Bank and the African Development Bank who can provide African countries with resources at 1.14% interest rate. If you go to a different channel of the World Bank called IDA, which is the International Development Association, you can get a loan for 0.75% interest rate. So clearly, those are better options for concessional loans for African countries to pull from. So what we're asking the World Bank, African Development Bank to do is to triple their resource base so that African countries can borrow up to $1.2 trillion. Again, we stopped talking about million, we've stopped talking about billion, we're now in the trillions because that's the scale of resources. African countries also have this perceived or real risk. There is risk and it's priced. It's priced through a country's credit rating. But we're also seeing that even when African countries are priced the same rating as a non-African country, there's still about a 2.9% interest hike in the interest rate that we can't explain. So you've already priced us for our perceived our risk,
Yeah.
but now there's an extra layer to it. So we're calling for a global financial architecture review, because whether this perception of risk, the reality of risk, or perception of risk, whatever it is, it's harming us. It's the reason why we might not reach all the potential we've been calling out for in this Africa Climate Summit. The potential that Africa has to solve the world's problem will be a hindrance if we don't have access to capital.
Yeah.
So the sense of the issue of capital, the quantity and the cost is a strong mitigation. It's a strong barrier to mitigation.
All right, but one of the things that, again, is the question of how urgent is this support needed? Because when you look at a lot of African countries, yes, we are all part of this conversation, yet some still feel like they're lagging behind in terms of some of the efforts they're putting in place. So how urgent and why do they need to make this a priority at the moment?
So globally, we agree that we shouldn't reach, our target is 1.5 degrees Celsius heating levels.
Yeah.
Currently, we have 6 years on our carbon budget as a world to cross over that mark. 6 years. So there is an urgency of now for us to start acting. But that urgency is further deepened because many African countries in particular, and several low-income countries, are struggling with debt distress. What that means is they don't have enough fiscal room to take care of healthcare that you mentioned earlier, agriculture, all the basic education, all the basic things the country needs, because they're paying their interest rates on their loans. A country like Nigeria in 2021 used 91% of its revenue to pay its debt. Where we're sitting right now, in April, you guys had to have a decision about paying your Eurobond interest rate or paying civil servants. These are real decisions countries are having to make. Imagine a country having to make that decision. They're not going to have enough resources to do the mitigation that we're saying is urgent, is needed now. That's why the financing becomes really important. And we know that Africa gets 2.4% only of investments in renewable energy in the world.
Yeah.
So 97% sits somewhere else. We're only getting 2.4%. So there's an urgency to attract more resources. There's an urgency to address our debt status so that African countries can deploy to doing all the wonderful things that Africa is actually bringing to the table to mitigate this climate challenge. It's natural resources, it's people, it's green minerals, it's forestries, all those things. If we deploy them well, it doesn't just benefit Africa, it benefits the rest of the world.
Yeah. So from where you sit, Sarah, one of the questions that I definitely would want to get your opinion on is, when you look at the global north, do you think they're doing enough in terms of climate change mitigation?
No, because there's a sense of global justice or injustice. The truth of the justice matter is Africa contributed the least to this problem. But the latest IPCC report says Africa is warming faster than other parts of the world. Yet in this same continent, 600 million people are without electricity. So there's no way we can choose not to develop our continent. And the global north has promised 100 billion, to provide 100 billion to us every year from 2022 to start mitigating the emissions that the pollutions they emitted. And here we are, 2023, nothing has been provided. So we need to talk about the justice element of it. We also need to talk about just the pure play private sector capital element of it. Why is there only 2.4% of global investment coming to Africa? Yes, we've talked about risk, but is that the only way? Is that the only reason why we have such low risk on the continent? So we really need to call to order that there is an urgency of now for Africa, and I think one of the beauties of this moment we're in is also, it's not just about Africa. Climate change doesn't need a visa to go next door. It doesn't need your permission to travel. It's a global public good. We're all going to be impacted. So if that urgency is not addressed, both on the justice element and on the private and the investment element, we're all going to be in this terrible situation together. So I think it behooves all the global community to come together. And that's one of the beauties of the Africa Climate Summit. We're on the same table. We're saying Africa is bringing this to the table. You need to bring your investments to the table. Yeah. You need to bring your promises and what you've asked us, what you've said you're going to provide to the table. And so it's a time of reckoning. And I'm really proud of the fact that it's happening in Kenya. It's happening now.
All right, because at the same time, we've been having this conversation and this argument that we have no plan B, but at the same time, Africa still receives the least amount of climate change support. Mm-hmm. So from where you sit and from your understanding of this issue, why is that the case?
Why do we receive the least?
The least, yes.
Well, I think there are two things. I think there's responsibility on the Africa side, and we should own up to our responsibility. If we have the following 70%, excuse me, of the world's cobalt is residing in the Congo. 60% of the world's solar generation capacity resides on the continent. Our wind generation power is close to no one else. So we have the renewable resources. We're sitting in Kenya with 92% of your electricity of geothermal. And we have those resources, and we know that cobalt is here. Zimbabwe and South Africa account for 70% of platinum in the world. Yeah. And that's required to do all the batteries and the transitions were required. Why aren't we adding value here? Mm-hmm. Because that's a way, if that's domestic resources, we can get that value and make sure we create jobs on the continent, make sure we have more value to our GDP and to our domestic resources so we can apply to other things. So I think there is a time of reckoning that enough of exporting unprocessed critical raw materials. Yeah. We want the world to have it, but we want to make sure we add value. The only way we can get up the chain, the value chain, is to add value. So we as a continent need to agree. We are no longer exporting these materials unprocessed. We will come on the continent, and if you want to partner with us here. So that's our responsibility as a continent, is to ensure that the value resides within the continent. But I think the risk perception and all the other things we talked about is, and quite frankly, the economic situation globally. Not a lot of countries have resources laying around. Yes, they're promised, yes, they're the greater emitters, but the reality is, and we're feeling it here, there is a crunch in the global economic system. So in many ways, my perspective is we shouldn't wait for them.
Mm-hmm. Because again, I mean, Africa contributes about barely 5% of global emission, but at the same time is paying the highest price for some of this emission. So in terms of government policies, what are some of the frameworks that they need to put in place to implement some of the things that you are saying, particularly in as far as value addition goes for the raw materials that we're exporting?
So listen, coming out of the summit just a few hours ago, we talked about carbon market development. Mm-hmm. There's actually an African carbon market development because we have 17% of the world's forestry. So between the Congo Basin, the Gabon mangroves, we absorb more carbon in Africa than the Amazon does. Yeah. But we don't have incentives. No one is costing our carbon appropriately and giving us resources for that. So the policies around creating an African carbon market initiative is an excellent one and is in progress right now. Because what we're saying is our natural resources can be a source of revenue for us. That's number one. Mm-hmm. Number two, we talked about the critical raw materials. There needs to be a united Africa-wide policy around adding value to some core critical materials used for electric batteries, used for all the transition things that we need. That needs to be put in place. Number three, the World Bank and the African Development Bank need to ensure that there's more resources that Africa can borrow concessional loans with. Yeah. So that's their responsibility. So I think there's a confluence of policies that we need to put together. But the good news is that things are happening. They need to happen faster, but they're happening.
Yeah. So, Sarah, there's this question about, we've had this conversation, de-dollarization, we had the conversation around reform, some of these multilateral institutions, but from where you sit, and as far as climate change mitigation goes, what are some of the urgent issues that really have to be addressed at that multilateral space?
The number one, above none, is the quantity of capital that is released for developing countries. And that is really urgent. So the G20 is meeting next week.
Yeah, next weekend actually.
Exactly. So 2 things on the agenda. Number 1, they convened an expert group to ensure that we can increase and optimize the balance sheet of a multilateral banks. Their experts told them that the World Bank needs to act fast to make that a possibility. Number 2, the AU would like a seat on the G20, and we have been campaigning for that for a few months and probably years now. And this is a great moment to ensure that Africa has a voice in the group of 20 who get to decide the global economic outlook. So it's not insignificant. Right now, South Africa is the 1 seat on the G20, but 1.4 billion people, or less of South Africa's population, also need to have a voice on that table. So we should all look out for next week, because it'll be a momentous time for us if the AU has a seat in the G20. So that's, capital's urgent, agency is urgent. The other things that are urgent are, in advance of COP28, all countries are supposed to develop their country plans. We developed a country plan pre-pandemic. The pandemic has changed a lot of things for many countries. Interest rates, inflation, cost of living has been greater. So we need to adjust our country development, our country plans, so that when we go to COP28, we go with one voice and Africa can ask for the right things together. Because again, Africa's superpower is not Kenya asking for what Kenya wants, or Nigeria asking for what Nigeria wants, or Ghana asking for what Ghana wants. It's Africa as a continent coming together to say this is what 1.4 billion people need.
All right, so Sarah, before we wrap up this conversation, in terms of technology and capacity building, what more needs to be done in Africa, even as we try and combat these climate change effects?
So we have abundance of human resources, and by 2050, 750 million young Africans will go into the workforce. What are we going to do with them? There is a burgeoning green economy that is going to have to absorb a lot of them. While the green economy is creating about 1.9 million jobs today, it has capacity to create exponentially more. But the technological know-how, we still need that technological know-how as we start innovating on whether it's electric cars or electric, mobility. So that upskilling our young people is very important.
All right, Sarah, thank you so much for making time to speak to us. Of course, this is not a conversation we can have in one sitting and totally explore all the areas, but thank you for making time, and thank you for staying with us throughout that conversation. That's how we wrap up this edition of Business Today. My name is Jimmy Mbogo, and also just to bid farewell to our former boss, Henry Giraiga. Thank you so much for your service, sir, and we'll see you around.